Hi, this is Steve Cook, and in this series of videos I'm looking at academic terms which are frequently used in biblical studies. In my last video I looked at redaction in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and in this video I'd like to look at redaction in the New Testament, specifically in the Gospels. In previous videos I've also talked about the academic term Deuteronomistic, and in this video I'd like to go to the other end of that spectrum and look at an academic term with a single letter. It is known as Q. It's a term that we come across in New Testament studies in reference to the Gospels. The four canonical Gospels, that is the Gospels which appear in our Bibles, are Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And of these Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke are so strikingly similar that scholars call them the Synoptic Gospels. They are similar in content and style, and sometimes so similar that they align word for word. John's Gospel is quite different in style and is studied in a different kind of category. When we look at Matthew, Mark and Luke though, one thing that stands out is that almost all of Mark appears almost word for word in Matthew and Luke. So much so that it seems that Matthew and Luke probably had a copy of Mark in front of them when they wrote their Gospels, and they copied much of Mark directly into their Gospels. Something like 97% of Mark is actually found in Matthew and Luke. And almost 60% of Matthew appears to have been copied from Mark. In these pie charts, we look at the area in blue, for example. This is the area that Matthew, Mark and Luke have in common. The area in green is the area that Mark and Matthew have in common, so that more than 60% or around 60% of Matthew's Gospel comes directly from Mark. But there's also an area that Matthew and Luke have in common. The area that's in orange in these graphs consists of about 200 additional verses which are not in Mark and are almost identical and are found in Matthew and Luke. This suggests to scholars that Matthew and Luke used Mark as their primary source and used at least one other source which they had in common. What was this source? In discussing this, scholars often use the term the two-source hypothesis, a theory that Matthew and Luke use two sources. But sometimes some scholars speak of a three-source or a fourth-source hypothesis as well, and we'll see the reasons for this in a moment. The two-source hypothesis argues that Matthew and Luke had Mark as one of their sources and another source for the material which they had in common. So most of Mark is copied directly by Matthew and Luke, but also a substantial part of their Gospels comes from this other source. Matthew has some material which is unique to his Gospel, which looks like he had another source as well, but so also does Luke, has material which is unique to his Gospel. Hence we have some scholars speaking of a fourth source hypothesis. Some scholars will argue that Mark was probably written first, that Matthew had it in front of him when he wrote, and that Luke had Matthew in front of him when he wrote. And so that's how the material has come through to Luke. And there are variations on this theme. Some think that Luke may have been written first. But the general consensus is that Mark was written first, and a large number of scholars think there was this other hypothetical source, which they call Q. Why Q? Q is the German, is an abbreviation of the German word Quelle, which means simply source. A hypothetical source used by Matthew and Luke in writing their Gospel. What do we know about Q? Well, it consists mostly of sayings of Jesus. It was almost certainly written in Koine Greek, the Greek of the New Testament, the common street Greek. Its quotations seem to come from the Greek version of the Old Testament rather than translating from the Hebrew. A collection of sayings like this wouldn't be unusual in the ancient world. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, consists of a collection of sayings. And also a very ancient Christian document called the Didache, the Teachings of the Apostles, also appears to have used these sayings as one of its sources. Why do we need to know this? Well, knowing how the Gospels are written helps to explain why they are so similar, yet different. It helps to identify each writer's unique perspective. If Mark was written first, why did Matthew and Luke feel the need to write a different version, which incorporated most of it, but with some changes? This contributes to our understanding of how the Bible was written and our understanding of the origins of Christianity. I hope that's been helpful to you.